So, Jean, if you don't mind introducing yourself and then passing the microphone.
Well, after listening to your French accent for 4 hours, I would hope you pronounce my name normally, Jean.
Okay, Jean.
But, Jean, sure, absolutely. So, unlike a lot of you in this room, I only have 2 brain cells, and I make wine for a living, like most of you. And I make wine for different people throughout the valley.
I hope I have more than 2 brain cells. I don't know. Trying to keep it all together. Niles Ackerley, I'm up at David Arthur Vineyards, where I direct viticulture, winemaking operations, and I've been there this will be my 11th vintage up there. So I feel like I've turned a few rocks over, but always learning and trying to prepare for each vintage and kind of start fresh each year. So it's always a good journey. And then I also make beer, Mad Fritz Brewing Company, which is kind of embracing the wine grower's approach to making beer.
Okay, and my name is Chris Lowe. I'm the owner and only employee of Consulting. I've been consulting in the Valley for quite a few years and then out on my own since 2012. And I guess I just kind of help my clients all across the Valley go all the way through the vintage, dealing with one challenge at a time, how to set up new vineyards, how to improve quality in challenging blocks, pests and diseases, all those sort of things.
Thank you. So the first question I'd like to ask you is really driven towards a winemaking application. We've seen with Federico, we've seen also with other scientific works that color enhance extractability of tannins. We've seen that colors is extremely sensitive to heat. How do you see yourselves adjusting to the management of color in order to increase the extraction of tannins or polymeric anthocyanins in the context of heat becoming more and more aggressive? Should you harvest later? Should you harvest earlier? Should you modify your cap management techniques in order to adjust to those conditions that are disturbing the fact that color is not accumulating at the same pace as sugar?
Okay, well, I can answer this in terms of the vineyard, but sure. not making wine. I'll pass it over to you guys after that. So this was really a year for me that tested your vineyard design. It made you really look at your blocks and think about all of the decisions you had made before. What was your row orientation? How wide are your cross arms? How much do you leaf and when? Do you have micro sprinklers? Do you use shade cloth? All of those things can really help to mitigate these really big heat events. And I think in terms of looking at harvest timing, it was really a year to throw out some of your preconceived notions about, okay, this is my block that always comes in first, and this is my block that always comes in late because it's surrounded by trees and it's always a little bit too vigorous because of that rootstock choice I made. Some of those blocks actually looked a lot better this year than ones that were accumulating sugar very, very quickly. So I would just say from a vineyard perspective, it was definitely a year to look at the infrastructure you have out there and your tools for mitigating really high heat events, and also maybe throw out some of your ideas of the normal order in which you have to pick things, and look at it a little bit differently.
Okay, so with heat, more block-specific decisions.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I think, it kind of summed up a little bit. This vintage kind of really grabbed 3 phases. One, we all expected because of high rain, a little bit bigger berry size than we end up having because of these heats, of course. And then we got these different heats, and I think that the strategy as far as the vineyard was concerned, when these heat happen, either you are equipped with misters, shade cloth, and you can kind of help mitigate some of that difference, either you're not. And if you're not, what are you going to do? What is going to be your strategy? Well, a lot of people say, what is the effect of watering before, after, during? On a lot of sites, we actually decided to apply water all through the heat spell. It helped a lot as far as dehydration was concerned on the berry, but of course it delayed everything even more. You showed this morning that obviously it kind of pulled things away. These heat spell delayed things, and you could see that phase two right after these heat spell. As you said, a lot of winemakers were doubting the fact that, oh my gosh, nothing is coming out. You would go in the vineyard, you were on test, and the extraction was just not there. Yeah. And at that time, I think it was, a lot of people started stressing because of Brix levels and integrity of the fruit, yield concerns, and so on and so on. And I think at that time, the measurement of all these, of all this data, all the color was extremely important to make decisions. So I think in the future, more and more people will have to take that in consideration, without a doubt, for winemaking decision down the line.
Yeah, it was interesting seeing just the data that you presented. September 20th was actually kind of like that optimum peak picking day for us. And, I do like to think of us as wine growers in the sense that we have 20 acres, we farm it ourselves, and we have, the keys to the tractors, and we can do anything we want at any time, but we are limited. And we don't have as much water as probably we'd like in those heat conditions. Putting eight gallons per week on a vine that's getting this kind of heat blast is really not that effective. And from my experience, you got to do something, but there's only so much you can do. And our more stressed vine blocks, we basically don't have a whole lot of canopy to start with. So you're always kind of trying to protect that as much as possible. And we tend to get, just because it's been on the vine, the green berries have had a lot of exposure. It seems like there's a lot of cuticle development that seems to protect it. Even in the high heat, we didn't really see a whole lot of burn, which is surprising. We did use a lot of water out there, but we ran out. So, you just use the tools you have and then hopefully get through it. We apply a lot of compost during the springtime and apply that, hoping to have a bit of buffer there as we go into the growing season. As far as picking, the heat spike definitely stalled things out, and everything was picked at pretty much lower sugars than we ever have had picked. But a lot of it was just making decisions and tasting it, and I've been really happy with the results. When we brought the fruit in, of course, the protocol that I applied was basically, lot per lot. And typically, macerations seem to go a little bit longer than normal, up to 17 days. We did not do any extended maceration, but, definitely still did a 3 to 5 day cold soak. But it really mirrored everything. Things stalled out, and we had to wait. And it was definitely I think if you pick on Brix, you just can't. We don't really do that anymore. But in general, if you kind of I have to pick at 25 plus or 26 or something like that, I think you're kind of missing the boat. There's a lot more going on there, and I really felt like the quality of the grapes coming off for the resulting wine was at lower Brix.
Yeah, so thank you. That really echoes what we've discussed. But really, in terms of cap management, the fact that you're trying to boost a little bit the color by postponing harvest until after the color peak has been reached, how does that translate in terms of tannin extraction? Did you end up extracting more or less tannin than 2016, where we had a narrower gap between those two, sugar and color peak? Would you like to comment on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think as you described in your last graph, it's a very not only site-specific vintage, but it's definitely a very winemaker-driven vintage as well. So I think these two parameters really, can't set any general rules. Right. As far as I'm concerned, I mean, anything, and we could talk about the fire later, anything that would pick a little bit after that delay got really, really high extraction. I enjoy tannins in wines. I really like their presence. I actually broke the barrier of 3,000 milligrams per liter on a lot, just because it's interesting and crazy. So I saw extremely high intake. Of course, the fire changed everything. And despite what a lot of literature said, I got to position myself the opposite. A lot of literature says extract less and be careful of the impact. I said we're going to make monster. We actually increased extraction 60% up front. because I wanted to kind of blend it in to try to be a part of component and not make a weak wine that then you're going to have a problem to. So I pushed it to a really, really big limit.
And you said you pushed it at the very earliest stages of the
Absolutely,
Yes.
Yeah. So to have really the possibility later in the extraction cycle to remove it off skin or not,
Yeah.
but at least all you wanted to extraction was done up front.
Very interesting. Yeah. Nice.
Similarly, yeah. I mean, we cold soak not around 50, 55, and then trying to accelerate tank warming into the 80s, and usually try and turn the tanks, the volume of the tank at least 3 times per day, and then obviously we slow that down as we get closer to dryness, and looking at more of those lavanol extractions and trying to eliminate that. And then also trying to press off as warm as possible. So when things start slowing down and the temperature starts creeping down, we want to bring that up and get it off as quickly as possible. I mean, we've all read the literature that does assist in trying to keep SpongeBob from pulling our anthocyanins away from us. And so, any tricks we can pull to assist that. But so far, just looking at the 17s in contrast to the previous vintages, I feel like there's, we're not quite through malolactic, but just I feel like it's really pretty strong, pretty good extraction. I don't have any numbers offhand, but I've been really happy.
Okay. So we will be discussing more specifically the topic of fire, but since I did not address it in the climatic footprint, would you like to say a few words on how the fire have affected the composition of your wine so far? Because it's part of the 2017 vintage.
Yeah, it sucks.
I only have a couple of observations about the fire and the smoke taint. And the first was that some of the blocks that were the hardest hit were the ones where the cuticle was the most damaged, and which made me think about, okay, how can you actually prevent that in the future? How can you even thicken that epicuticular wax way earlier in the season? And it was tough this year because we did have a vigorous spring, and we did have a lot of canopies, and there were some vineyards that had to be suckered like 3 or 4 times. So it was still a year that we needed to try to leaf early, whether or not you had a crew to do that or not. Maybe that might have helped. I don't know. But definitely my blocks that had an intact cell wall did a little bit better for the smoke taint. And I also heard the casual observation that lower lying areas got a little bit more of the smoke taint than the others, but I'm not sure about that in terms of exact numbers.
As far as I'm concerned, it was very site-specific again. I kind of had, for many clients, roughly I have 483 different lots. 20-some were impacted by the fire, but not always in a very intuitive way. Of course, one block that we have on Mount Veeder, that was surrounded by woods, and we were forced to pick after the police finally opened. Well, guess what? It is smoked in, and I think it is all our duty as winemakers, not to put it in wine, to find solutions. There's not really great solutions to measure that. So one of the things that I do is decided to postpone any blending as long as possible to make sure that you hydrolyze and they're re-released and you actually know exactly where these taints are or not. As far as vineyard was concerned, whatever was not picked, I decided to pick in 48 hours. We had crews that were picking for 26 in a row. They asked to do so because they wanted to save the work that they put all year long, which was 250 tons in 48 hours was a fairly challenging moment in my life, not to say the least. But we see patterns of contamination that are not always logical, which is kind of interesting. And then you really pick your battle. We decided to rinse any residual ash just to give an additional safety. We know that water addition to wine is not exactly an issue in Napa, so why not do it? And we kind of grabbed it in that sense. And I think that's really will determine kind of the future, and I would definitely advise people to take their time because it's a ticking bomb.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we kind of have to see this stuff shake out and see, how these wines evolve. We had 2 lots. The estate up on Pritchard Hill was pretty much picked. We had a few little bits and pieces that I feel I can still taste a little bit in there. We've gotten together, groups of us, and tasted our wines in contrast with other wineries and other vineyard blocks. And we have stuff that was directly impacted with fire, literally scorched. And we tried to do a buffer pick on that. And that came in, when it was finished, all said and done, about 10 ppbs. And it's pretty ashtray. And so we're playing around with some treatments to see what we can do with it. In general, the other stuff that is lower level is on that fence and just figuring out how far, what we should do with wines in that category is difficult, especially, the numbers are the numbers and then the sensory is the sensory. So I think it's good to keep those wines separate as long as possible and see how they evolve and see how much hydrolysis we see. And there aren't too many treatments that we can apply. Very, very unique situation this year.
Something that I think, Thibaut, is quite important as far as the vineyard side. I think it's going to come back. And I think we all have to prepare to learn about it, to educate ourselves, to think of plans, to maybe fund, like the Australian do, research to help us find solution to these issues, because I really doubt the fact that they're going away. So.
Hopefully Eric Hervé will help shed some light. The research I've done is that we've never had a scientific study looking at so late in the season fire exposure. And that's why we were a little bit lost, because this is new, but as you said, we had fire until recently, so it's going to become some one of those events that in Chile they had some fire also this year. So more and more vintages are going to have to deal with a fire footprint. It's just part of the global warming attributes. Is there any one? Oh, sorry.
I was going to add, one of the other issues we had is just logistics, and you mentioned it too, just labor in general, just getting vineyard work done in a timely manner. And then, heck, when a fire hits and you've been evacuated, it's pretty hard to pick fruit. It's pretty hard to go to the winery. We were all faced with the situation of sneaking into the winery to try and keep those wines going. And how do you handle extraction in that scenario unless you have like these automatic pump over devices off your phone or something like that? So we're obviously very limited from that standpoint. And if you're planning on picking that week of the fire, well, good luck. We had to wait another 2 weeks, and so exposure is increased, and our risks are increased too. So. Yeah, again, I mean, logistically, in that sort of environment, there's not a whole lot you can do. It's hard to prepare for that.
Yeah. Is there anyone willing to ask a question to our panel? Yes.
For Chris, how are you thinking about heat spikes now? Do you have any innovative ideas about managing them?
So the question is, how are you thinking about heat spell remediations? Anywhere of any innovations?
I don't know about innovations. I definitely need to look at that paper about more details about misters. But when you think about how to mitigate such high temperatures, to me it really goes down to your trellis. And planting a VSP anymore doesn't really seem to make sense. I think a lot of people are going back to a controlled California sprawl, so that all you get all year is dappled light as opposed to some really, really direct light on one side or the other. I don't know about you guys here, but my morning side of the vines looked a lot worse than the afternoon side in a lot of sites, especially those parallel or perpendicular orientations along the Silverado Trail. And I was just like, oh my God, we opened the wrong side. No, we didn't. It was just that hot. So just stop trying to think about, we have to get more light on this side,
right.
Or more heat because of the heat. So I would have preferred to have more leaves out there as opposed to even more misters.
Yeah.
To be honest, although misters certainly are going to help to increase the relative humidity and avoid some of that damage. So I'd really think about orientation and the width of your cross arms. Stop cramming everything into lots of rows and lots of tiny little vines.
What about postponing pruning as a way to shift the maturation under cooler days? Have you experienced with that? Postponing pruning after bud break.
Okay. So in attempt to postpone the bloom date as well?
Exactly.
Sometimes they catch up. Yeah, I've definitely tried to play with that, more so in the other ideas of areas where we wanted to get bud break earlier to get earlier ripening? Does pushing it back really help? I think it's going to depend on the erratic nature of the heat spikes moving forward, because sometimes if it's not quite 106, but if it's 99 and for 10 days long, that will actually speed things up. So I think it's hard to hit those phenological dates perfectly.
Okay.
Not sure.
Yeah, I could add to that too. I think you can't do that when you're cane pruning. So, I mean, you have to basically pick that position and run with it. But that, maybe perhaps that's another way you can modify the canopy some, is with cane pruning. But when you could stall it some, and we've tried to do that too. And sometimes I feel like it always catches up. It's hard to, it's just the season is the season, and the areas that have more water in them definitely stall a little bit more than the others that are more well drained. But yeah, sometimes you're just at Mother Nature's whim.
Yeah, and if you do that, I think it's a timely issue as well. And you could do that on a small property if you own 15 acres. If you're a big grower, to postpone and have that pruning rush is almost logistically impossible.